Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of Through My Eyes with Professor Bolaji Akinyemi. Prof, welcome to the program this evening.
Thank you.
Prof, I don't know if you have one or two things to say before we get into the program this evening. There's so much going on around the world at the moment.
Well, thank you very much. Number one, I'd like to welcome our viewers or our participants to the first of the second year of our program. This will be the first program of the second year. And perhaps since so many people have joined us in the course of the first year, let me repeat perhaps what we said at the beginning of this program, which is that this program presents, if you like, a third world centric view, an analysis and narratives of what's happening in the world. It is not that commentators on CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera are wrong. No, it's just that they see things from different perspectives. They bring in scholars who are Eurocentric. And in the case of Al Jazeera, they bring in analysts who, in a way, are Middle East centric. Even when they bring in, quote unquote, people of color analysts, they tend to bring them in from America or from Europe or what have you, who know the parameters by which CNN, BBC, whatever have you, by which their programs are run. You cannot really be voicing analysis which perhaps show up the United States or show up the BBC, and yet be welcome on their programs. So we supplement the analysis which they've done. They are not wrong, and we are not wrong. We simply provide another narrative. For example, take the G7, the NATO, the summit between the United States and Britain. What African issues came up? None. Well, in the case of G7, which we will address in detail later, there were issues which, in a supplementary way, addressed African issues, but from a European or an American perspective. So, in our case, our analysis is the third world perspective, without rubbishing narratives that show the United States. So I thought I should, re-emphasize that at the beginning of our second year. Number two, if you will permit me, Mr. Moderator, to do this, it's been a good week or a good day for good news. The American Congress, which I normally criticize, I'm applauding today for passing the bill declaring a day to celebrate the end of slavery in America. I mean, they call it the Juneteenth Day. I know that they said that's the day that most slaves that they had been freed by Abraham Lincoln. I mean, it's a long time coming, but still, thank goodness and thank God for small masses. The bill was approved by Senate, by the House of Representatives, and it should be signed today by President Biden. It's a good day for not only our African American brothers, but it's a good day for all of us who wish to celebrate freedom. Number three, I congratulate the American Supreme Court on upholding the Obamacare plan. This was something that Trump went after. He tried all kinds of gimmicks, and finally, having loaded the Supreme Court with people who shared his views, they were expecting that the Supreme Court would declare the Obamacare plan unconstitutional by 7 votes to 2. Surprisingly, a surprising majority, they declared that the Obamacare plan was okay. Now, this should be a lesson to all those who hold the views that justice must be done. Let heavens fall. There is no one concept of justice. It's all interpretation of the law and how you relate the law to environmental conditions. The Supreme Court read what's happening in the United States, the last election, how it rejected Trumpians' views on a lot of things, including the Obamacare plan, and brought into the White House, into the Senate, into the House of Representatives, people who were in favor of Obamacare, and therefore ruled 7-2 that the Obamacare was okay. So I do rapidly. I can see the look on your face as if I'm talking too much. But very rapidly, let me pay my own tribute on behalf of all of us on the death of President Kenneth Kaunda. I had the privilege of having met him when he was a freedom fighter in what was North Rhodesia then, later on becoming Zambia. And then, of course, I also interacted with him as a foreign minister when he was president of Zimbabwe. One of those who gave really most of his life, his political activities and vision for the liberation, especially of Zimbabwe and South Africa. And he paid heavily for it. His country was bombed by the South African Air Force. There were attempts to overthrow him by mercenaries from South Africa and what have you. He also contributed to the liberation of Mozambique and Angola. He is one of the last giants on the African continent whose life was defined by the and liberation struggle and the anti-apartheid struggle. He belongs in the same pantheon as Mandela, as Mugabe, as what was President oh dear, the president of Mozambique who died in that air crash. He belongs in that pantheon, and we lost him today to the cold hands of death. But the deal, he lived a fulfilled life, and Africa will always remember him. And Africa should, I hope there will be a hall of fame of African giants. And I hope that people who've betrayed Africa will not find their names or their positions in that African Hall of Fame. So I'm sorry you asked me for a few introductory comments, but it's been a good week for us in Africa and for lovers of freedom. So there you are.
Yes, Prof. But when we look at President Kaunda and the likes of Mandela that you have mentioned, it kind of leads me to think, Prof, that can you hear me? Can you hear me, Prof? Okay, let me look into that. Looks like you've lost audio on this end. Bear with me, Prof.
I can't hear you. I can't hear you.
You can't hear me. Bear with me, Prof.
I can't hear you.
Okay, sir. 1 second. I'll just get the technical team to have a look at that. Just bear with us 1 second, Prof. Check one. Check one. Ladies and gentlemen, please bear with us. We just lost connectivity to Prof. We're trying to sort that out. He's going to rejoin the session in a minute. But we were talking about President Kaunda, one of the lights of Africa who passed on today, and what he represents. And the question I was putting to Prof was this: do we still have leaders in Africa that are like some of the leaders we had in the past, like Nelson Mandela? Do we still have those sorts of leaders in Africa today? We're just trying to get Prof back on. As soon as he gets back on, we'll bring him on back onto the show. Please bear with us while I try to get him reconnected onto the platform. We're going to get that resolved in a few minutes. There's a lot, quite a lot happening in the world today that happened even last week, this week, that Prof is going to be sharing his insights on. He's going to be talking about NATO, China. He's going to be talking about his views about the Geneva Summit, that historic event, and what happened there. We're going to try to get him back on shortly. Just checking that we haven't. Let's see. Okay, he's still trying to connect on there. Once I get him on, I will let you know. But in the meantime, if you have some views that you feel are important to you and you want to hear Prof talk about, please put them in the comments. I will pass those views to him so he can address them. So bear with us as we resolve this technical issue. Check, Prof. Can you hear me now, sir?
Yes, I can.
Yes, you can. Fantastic. I will get you back on now. Prof, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yes. All right. Thank you, sir. Sorry for that. That was the technical issue on this end. We were talking, Prof, about President Kaunda who passed today. And my question to you was, do we still have leaders like that today in Africa?
No, I'm afraid not. I think we've all our leaders have been in their domestic issues. And those who probably have a vision for a Pan-African vision don't perhaps have the resources to push that kind of vision. The president of Rwanda, for example, if he had the resources, will probably have embraced the mantle of Kaunda, Mandela, the first president of Angola, the first president of Mozambique. Those who have the resources, like surprisingly, Botswana does have the resources, but Botswana has never really been in that ambience of Pan-African leadership. They've never been. So, and I think that is really what the problem is. I mean, I would be guilty of being short-sighted, I suppose, if I don't say that, Nigeria that has the resources is not driven by a leadership that has that kind of, Pan-African vision. The last one we had was Obasanjo. And even then, I'm not sure that he used the position that he had to advance a Pan-African vision in the mode of Kaunda or in the mode of the other African leaders that I have mentioned. But basically, African leaders are looking inward. They are not espousing a Pan-African vision. They are not.
They're not. All right, Prof. Let's go back to the G7 and start from there. Following the meeting, the group released a communique, and they touched on various things. Last week, we asked you what you were expecting to see. This week, the question to you, Prof, is what do you think about the outcomes and what they talked about post the meeting, and what was missing for you?
Okay. Let me answer the last question first. What was missing for me was a third world perspective, a third world, the issue affecting the third world from third world interests. And what do I mean by that? They decided on let's take the COVID-19, that they were going to release the 1 billion doses, with the Americans contributing 500 million. But what we want was lifting the intellectual property rights for vaccine manufacture so that countries in the third world who have the capacity to manufacture those vaccines could be given the legal right to start manufacturing them. Of course, they will have to meet all the health, technical, and what have you, as laid down by the World Health Organization. But they approached it from the point of view of donation. They would donate vaccines to us. My point of view and the point of view of, well, countries that have that capability to manufacture vaccine is we don't want donations. That could be level one, stage one. But please remove the intellectual property rights and, for at least this particular pandemic, give us the right to make the vaccine. That's the first one. The second was they now came up with infrastructural, again, quote unquote, donation to especially African countries in order to counter Chinese infrastructural development in Africa. What is not really clear to me from the language of the communique is it an either or position? You take our own infrastructural donation, you don't take the Chinese one. You take the Chinese one, you don't take our own. Now, we don't want to be a pawn in the chess game between the Western world and the Chinese. If you think it is right for you to make infrastructural contribution to African development, then do so. And not as a game, as a penalty to, checkmate the Chinese. If the Chinese want to do their own, let them do their own. We are independent countries. We don't want to be locked into a chess game between the Western countries and the Chinese. But they took this from the position of their competition with the Chinese. And that's really, I find that disappointing. Thirdly, is still this issue of France's economic relationship with its former African territories. Again, what has been called the colonial tax. That till today, former French colonies are still being asked to pay 10% colonial tax to France. For what? For French invading their territories, for French colonizing their territories, for France exploiting their territories. The 90% of export proceedings from African Francophone countries must be deposited in the French Central Bank, and only 10% will be released to them. Anything that is more than 10%, they must borrow at interest charges and pay those interest and the capital back to France as if it is French money rather than the proceeds of the African countries. Any contract which the Francophone countries have to award must first be given to a French company. It's only if there are no French companies interested in that contract at their own terms that they can then offer that contract to a British or a German or an American company. I mean, all these nauseating relationship, economic relationship that France has with its African territories, they were not raised, they were not touched. I don't blame, let's get this right, I don't blame Ramaphosa, who, well, he wasn't supposed to be representing Africa. I suppose he was representing South Africa. I don't blame him for not raising these issues. Afterwards, he was only invited as a guest. He's not a member of G7. And being invited as a guest kind of, puts him in a position of a supplicant. So to that extent, I'm not blaming President Ramaphosa of South Africa. But, it would have helped if the OAU itself were to have, the African Union were to have a special economic summit where it will lay out a package of African economic interests that will be argued in these global meetings. That at least will strengthen the hand of any African leader who finds himself in that kind of a setting.
But Prof, one point that has come out from this is when we look at the history of African relations with the G7. For example, according to the stats I have here, in 2000 we had South Africa, Nigeria, Algeria, we had Senegal. Even the WHO was invited at the time. 2005, we had Ethiopia, Tanzania. 2009, we had Angola. It looks like the focus on Africa is beginning to wane when it comes to bringing Africa into the context of these discussions within the G7. What can Africa do to get representation at the seat if we're not invited?
Well, number one, it is the host country that decides who to invite as guests, the host country. So I'm sure when France hosts it, the African countries it will pick, or the African country it will pick, may not be South Africa. If Germany is the host, the African countries it will pick may not be South Africa. If the United States is the host, the African countries it may pick will be different. It's like it is left to the host. So it's kind of this short-sightedness, I would say, or the hidden agenda of the host that determines who to pick or who not to pick. Because as we said last week, irrespective of the shenanigans going on in Nigeria, our economy is still the largest in Africa. So under what yardstick do you pick South Africa and leave out Nigeria? If you are not going to use economic status as the yardstick, if you're going to use an African country that can speak for Africa with confidence, why not pick the president of Rwanda? Why not pick him? So I don't know what was playing in the mind of Great Britain when he decided to pick Cyril Ramaphosa to that conference. So I will still go back to the suggestion that I made, which is that the African Union needs to be up and doing. it's kind of become rather laid back. I mean, one knew the time when, God rest his soul, wherever he is, when what's the name of the president of Libya? Gaddafi. When Muammar Gaddafi was on the African scene, even when Obasanjo was on the African scene, um, uh, Thabo Mbeki, Chisano, when they were on the African scene, we had a more vibrant Pan-African body than what we have now. So maybe it's left. You see, it's left to the African leaders themselves to ginger up the African Union. But as we said earlier on, when we were talking about President Kenneth Kaunda, they all seem to be bogged down on their domestic scene. Uh, uh, the ECOWAS is bogged down in Chad, is bogged down in Mali, is battling, the Islamic State of West Africa in the Sahel. Then now you have Ethiopia battling the insurrection in the Tigray province of Ethiopia. So they have to get their acts together internally and then ginger up the African Union so that we don't get treated as just an offshoot of whatever is happening on the global scene.
Prof, I think that based on what you've said there, I'm going to throw something out at you now. I think maybe we should have a town hall session where we look at African foreign policy, what it was in the past, what it is today, and what we think the future of it should be, and discuss that point because I hear you saying there, African Union should be doing more. But how do we do more? What exactly should we be doing there? So expect a town hall to deal with that, Prof.
Fine. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry that at the death of my friend President Rawlings. He would have been a good participant in that town hall because he had an activist Pan-African vision. In my private conversations with him, and even in the official conversation when he was, president of Ghana and I was foreign minister, I saw that and I saw his push, just like President Mandela, his push for Nigeria to get up and play its active role. He was so disgusted with the laid back position of Nigeria. He was. And maybe you can get former President Thabo Mbeki to come onto the town hall. And a few former foreign ministers, maybe.
I've asked the question. You have given me your answer. Now I need to get working.
All right.
We'll work on that, Prof. But
all right.
Just before we leave this G7 point and we go to the Geneva summit, because I think quite a lot on the Geneva summit to talk about there. But very briefly, China was called out for its treatment of the minority Muslim group and the way it treated protesters in Hong Kong, and China hit back. What is your take on that, Prof?
I think that, and I must say this with all due respect for President Biden, and conscious of the fact that there was a time when I was a refugee myself, running from military dictatorship of one kind in my own country. I must say that making, you see, China is going to be a superpower. It's an upgoing global power. It doesn't make sense to make an enemy of China. It doesn't make any sense. There has to be an understanding among the foreign policy elite in the United States that you cannot expect China to sign on to a world order that the United States put in place when it was the number one global power in the world. You cannot. If the shoes were reversed, would the United States just sign on to a world order that was set up by another global power that, in any case, is on its way down, or that it has to share the world with this new global power? Would the United States sign on to it? Every global power seeks to make a world order that serves its own interests. If it is not in a position to do this unilaterally, then you negotiate, you bargain. I mean, after all, there was a time, and that's what the United Nations actually represents, when the United States and Russia negotiated a world order, negotiated a process and a structure that stabilized that world order. Not that pushed one against the other. There's no way that will have been stable. And that's why you haven't had a world war, a global world war, since the end of the Second World War. The United States was not going to attack Russia, and Russia was not going to attack the United States. And so they worked out, well, what scholars ended up calling, what did we call it now? Anyway, some understanding, some nuclear understanding that prevented one from attacking the other. And gradually they started working on this strategic arms limitation talks, which came up in the Geneva talks. But we had a balance of terror, a balance of power between the United States and Russia. Now you cannot seek to demonize the Chinese and have a stable world order and a stable understanding with them. I am not, please don't misunderstand me, I am not in approval of Chinese domestic policy. I'm not in approval of Chinese economic policies in Africa, just as I am not in approval of the United States domestic policy towards people of color, and I am definitely not in approval of some of the things that the United States or France or Britain do in Africa. They meddle in our elections. They meddle in our domestic politics. So it's no use pretending to be holier than thou when it comes to their perception of China and their treatment of China. It's no use. Biden is making a mistake
I,
because I had what Putin, the reply Putin
absolutely.
gave to that rude American journalist who said, "Well, how about you know uh, the situation of Black Lives Matter in the United States? If you want to talk about the way we deal with human rights, issues in Russia."
Yes, Prof. I think that's a good segue into the Geneva summit, as it's been called. And following that almost 3 hour meeting, President Biden came out and he said, I did what I came to do. And my question to you, Prof, is do we now feel safer in the world because this meeting has taken place? What's your view on that, Prof?
I don't know whether that is the right question to ask. Because I would have asked a different question, with all due respect, sir, which is, did either party change the mind of the other party? And my answer would have been no. There's probably a clarity now as to how far you can push Putin or how far Putin can push Biden. But and that has to be a cold-hearted analysis and conclusion that will not be driven by domestic politics. Because if it's driven by domestic politics, you are going to make a mistake. The United States has to be careful. And this is a lesson I learned as, a refugee from Nigeria, a freedom fighter from Nigeria, which is American interests are not going to be jeopardized by the United States having to fight dictatorship in Nigeria or in Africa. They will know how far they can go. Statements will be issued, and but actions that would jeopardize American interests, no. What I'm starting to see is that Russian and Belarusian and Asian freedom fighters are thinking that the United States will fight its battle for it against either Russia or against China. They will be making a mistake. I made a point about what we used to call the New York issue when I was a postgraduate student in the 60s in the United States, and which is, will America sacrifice New York if Russia attacks Belgium? And the answer is no. Even in spite of Article 5 of the NATO treaty. Of course, the Russians are not going to do that because there may be a red line there, even for the Americans. But the Americans are not going to sacrifice New York if for Russia attacking, a village in Norway or something like that. Therefore, the freedom fighters or the democracy activists in Russia, in Hong Kong, in Burma need to know how far the United States or Western democracies will come to support them. I keep hearing that question from American journalists. If that Russian, activist dies in prison, what price will you make Putin pay? Are they expecting Biden to say, I will then send bombers over Russia? The worst that will happen is economic sanctions. That is, if there are more economic sanctions to be levied. Number 2 or number 3, I don't know which number now. Something continues to baffle me. And let me share this with you. Maybe you will have an answer to it. When they were talking about cyber attacks, and Biden says, I made it clear to Putin that we have cyber capability. And if these cyber attacks continue, Russia will know the extent of our cyber capability. I mean, as a scholar, I then ask, what has America been waiting for all this time? Even under Trump, there were cyber attacks from Russia that went after some of their critical government institutions. And then under Biden, you've had the attacks on oil pipeline, then you've had the attacks on the attacks, and you are saying if there are any more attacks, Russia will find out. In fact, both Trump and Biden should be impeached for not using that capability now, because what holds the global system together is this question of retaliation. And if you haven't used your capability by now, in fact, you've given the impression to Russia that you don't have that capability. What's holding you back? So, I think that hopefully both sides understand each other now. Whether it makes the world safer, I think it will take more than one meeting at that level to make the world safer. More meetings at foreign ministers level, more meetings at ambassadorial levels, and what have you. Don't forget, and I will keep saying it, what you hear from the CNN and the BBC are American and British views. When they were talking about exchange of prisoners, what you had on the CNN was that the Russians in American prisons, were criminals, hardened criminals, and what have you. Do you think on CNN you will hear that the Americans held in Russian prisons were actually spies? You think you will hear that? You won't. You won't. And unfortunately, where I don't listen to Russian TV, and I also don't listen to Chinese TV to hear from their own mouth their own narratives. So I don't know whether we are safer today because of what took place in, um, in in Geneva. But let me end up on this note on the Geneva thing. I am a firm believer in summits. I am a firm believer in consultations. I'm a firm believer in diplomatic meetings. You can't go wrong. But with one proviso, don't mislead the other party about what you will do and what you can do if they cross a red line that you've laid down. And don't try to provoke them by crossing a red line which they've made clear is their own red line.
Prof, before we close tonight, there's one point you've touched on that I wonder if you can help to address that as the last question. And that is the point around NATO. When President of Putin was asked about Ukraine joining NATO, he said no comments. And in an unprecedented move, we've seen NATO now confronting China and saying that China represents systemic challenges to the transatlantic security agreement. What is your take on that, Prof?
You've asked the Chinese question and you've asked the Ukrainian question. The two have to be separated. I think that Ukraine, in fact, it's not only Biden, it's not only Putin refused to answer the Ukrainian question. Biden also refused to answer the Ukrainian question. And I have listened to the Secretary General of NATO, and he also forged the issue. What this seems to me is that Ukraine is a red line issue for Russia, and that NATO understands that, the United States understands that. They've probably worked out some understanding through back channels that Ukraine will not try to recover Crimea, and will not try to recover that part of its territory where Russian speakers occupy, and there are Russian troops there, that Ukraine will not try to recapture them, and that Russia itself will then not cross over into the rest of Ukraine. I believe there is probably some understanding there. As regards this, China being of strategic, is it concern or interest to the Western alliance, there's not even an agreement. Remember, Macron of France said NATO is North Atlantic Treaty Organization. What will it be doing confronting China in the Southeastern Asian seas or area? He has asked that question. Should NATO be expanding its interests to go and confront China in his backyard? He says so in his own briefing of the press. So NATO itself is not united on that issue. They probably allowed that into the communique in order to satisfy Biden. Happy to have the United States fully back in NATO, and therefore, but I don't expect that we are going to see NATO showing a presence of its troops in the Southeast Asia area. American troops, yes, and also don't forget NATO had supported America in Afghanistan, which to some extent had been a theater of Cold War interest between Russia and the United States. But in areas that China is laying claim to in terms of interests, not in terms of occupation, I don't think we'll find NATO moving into that area.
Prof, there's a question here from YouTube that I think our viewers would like you to answer. The person says here, do you think it is possible for Putin to meet Biden's expectations, notwithstanding the agreements reached in Geneva, when Biden has publicly called Putin a killer and a man without a soul?
I think, and I said on this program, that was a misspeak. I'm sure even the presidents don't apologize for use of terms. I don't think Biden is going to repeat that mistake of repeating what he said, because look, there is no Western president in the world, and I'm saying this with all seriousness. There is no Western president who is not a killer. Every Thursday, the CIA brings a list to the American president of whom they should target by drone, especially in Iraq, in Syria, in Afghanistan. That this has always been an American tradition. Number two, what were British, American, French special forces doing in Libya that led to the death of Gaddafi? Remember what Mrs. Clinton said? We came, we saw, and he died, referring to Gaddafi. So what are we talking about? Acts done by those special forces were approved by their heads of state. So, I mean, it doesn't pay, especially, our people have a saying, you point one finger at somebody, three fingers are pointing back at you when it comes to, this, to protection of interests. When you have, forces, special forces, Marines, SEALs, E Squadron, and what have you.
Prof, I was going to end, but you're going to bear with me. One more question for you, again from YouTube on this one. And it's a point you've addressed, but I want to put this question to you. Read the G7 invitation of South Africa's president. Nigeria is 100 out of 102 on the Good Governance Index. Shouldn't we position ourselves rightly first in order to demand the respect we deserve? And I think, Prof, the point here is this. Do we fix our good governance before we start to address our standing on the international stage? Or do we try to address that standing anyway, regardless of good governance going on in our countries?
I'm not going to link the two together. We must fight for good governance in our country, but at the same time, we must fight for our position on the global scene. We have the capability, economic capability. As I said, our economic capability in terms of GDP is higher than that of South Africa. And, there are different indices that you can use to define what a failing state is. Look, I can sit down with, maybe my former students or my fellow scholars, and we could draw up an indices involving Northern Ireland, involving Scotland, involving problems between Britain and France over fisheries, and start to define them in terms of whether the United Kingdom will still remain united in 5 years, in 10 years' time. That doesn't then mean that when you are going to have a summit where those interests can be defined, you then delete you then delete Britain and ask it to go and solve its problems first. There's no country you address that way. There isn't. And this is an issue that I've raised even with some of my American friends, that some of the problems that they have in the United States, if they have those problems in Belarus or even in Russia, they will be talking about Russia being a failed state or what have you. But they don't say so because there are other indices that still makes the United States a global power. There are indices that make Nigeria an African power that you cannot ignore. But governance, yes, is an issue we need to address, and we need to address it immediately. We don't have until tomorrow to address the issue of our governance domestically. We don't.
Thank you so much for that, Prof. Apologies for overrunning on time there, but these were good questions that I wanted to put to you from our audience on YouTube. Thank you very much for that, Prof. And
thank you.
We will start working on that town hall where we look at African foreign policy, the past, the present, the future, and how we should shape that. So thank you so much to our viewers for bearing with us. And thank you for staying with us through that technical hitch we had there. We will address that for next time. Thank you, Prof. Bye. See you next week.